This one is a tough one, right? Those are some really big questions. If anybody has heard me speak before, I usually joke and laugh, and I may do that, but this is also a pretty heavy topic. So for those that might be new, or maybe haven't met me yet and we haven't been able to interact, my name is Angie Von Slaughter, and I'm a local designer that is also a communicator. So I love being able to be a part of the One Church team and being able to join with them in building this wonderful community. It's really been a space that, as Ron mentioned, that is inclusive, it's healing, and it's just been a helpful place for people of all walks of life. So today we're discussing prayer, and I happen to believe that our life really is a sacred act of prayer and worship, just by living, and it's a never-ending dialogue with God. But what happens when that dialogue becomes a monologue? What happens when God is silent? And I see a few heads shaking because you've probably experienced it at some point. And so we're continuing our Why series where we're asking the hard questions. Why do my prayers go unanswered? And I have to be honest, this is a heavy one. This is tough. This is a tough one. And so honestly, before I go any further, I just want you to know that whatever your view is on prayer, that is okay. Wherever you're at with prayer, that is okay. This might be a triggering sermon for some people because you might be in the midst of unanswered prayers, and that's okay too. If you feel that way, I want you to know you're not alone and you have a community that loves you. So this is one that I think really needed a space for grieving. Last week, Aaron talked about why suffering. Why is there suffering in the world? And I think that's why this question, why do my prayers go unanswered, is so important. Because we're not talking about my prayer being unanswered of acing a test, although we pray those things too, or getting that parking spot, right? We have those prayers too, but what we're really talking about when we say, why do my prayers go unanswered, are the big ones, the tough ones, the moments of grief, the moments of pain. And so I think what was interesting is in studying for this message, I was amazed at how many pastors and church traditions are so quick to have snap judgment answers to a very, very complicated question. And I think it's easy for me to say that because while I'm ordained, I'm technically not a pastor. I am a designer by trade, which is great because I think it gives me liberty to say what I want without feeling like I have the cloak of being your pastor on my shoulders. I appreciate it. I hope you do. But I was amazed at how many people were so quick to have a nice, neat, and tidy answer for this. All of them the same. I spent hours studying and researching going, everybody's giving the same answer. But it's sort of like in our biblical study that we did on the wisdom tradition, that you have lived through Proverbs, and it says this is how you should be, but then you get further on into Ecclesiastes, and you're realizing, okay, this is how I should live my life, but sometimes my life doesn't go that way. And then what do I do with that? And so I think there's nothing neat and tidy to this life, and certainly nothing neat and tidy to a desperate, unanswered prayer. So I want to take a look at what I think is the largest unanswered prayer. There's a powerful example of unanswered prayer in the Gospels, and you can find it in Matthew chapter 26 and Luke 22. And I just have them referenced for you to go ahead, and if you want to read those on your own, you can. We're going to skim over the story for you this morning. And here we get a glimpse that is really a view into Jesus' humanity. We discover that Jesus knows of his impending death, and he is deeply troubled by it. Deeply. He's moved. He embarks really on a long journey to, which really is the journey of the soul, but to Mount Olives, where he takes his disciples along with him. And when they arrive to Mount of Olives, Jesus expresses that his soul, I loved this, how he worded it, because I thought, man, I can relate. He expresses to them that his soul was swallowed up in sorrow. So we're not talking like Jesus says, oh yeah, I'm excited, I'm going to go die on the cross. His soul is swallowed up in sorrow. It's heavy, he's burdened. And he does something. He asks a simple request that his disciples would stay with him and wait, that they would stay awake. And in some translations, it said they would pray. And he's asking for them to be with him while he goes into the garden in solitude and prays. So then Jesus falls face down and basically begs God. That's my translation. And it does say he falls face down, but that's how I picture, just wrecked with agony and sorrow, face down, God, please. And he says, Father, if you're willing, take this cup, the cup of suffering, take this from me. And I thought, how many times have we said that to God in our suffering? God, if there's any way, please change my circumstances. God, please help me. Lord, please heal my child. God, please save my marriage. Please rescue me. God, please. Please. And then, ironically, Jesus follows up with this simple and yet profound words. He says, yet not my will, but yours be done. Which I thought, wow, that is such a strong thing to say after you're just begging God. And really, it's as if Jesus is saying, I know what I want, but things are far bigger than I can see or understand, and I don't know if I can, but I'm just going to try to trust you. I want nothing more than my circumstances to change, but if for some reason they can't, then will you walk with me through it? And that's my take on it, and yet so many people would like to take the stance that the scripture is purely about obedience and doing God's will. But I have to say, if we're not careful, those words can be damaging to others. So you're saying a family that lost a child because of the cup of suffering, that's God's will? You're saying that heartache from a broken relationship, that's God's will? You're saying that a healing that never took place that you desperately cried for, that's God's will? And where do we end with that? What about violence and rape and poverty and homelessness? That's God's will? You can see the danger in projecting our very human view onto what we think God's will is and how prayer works and does not work. Things can get out of hand. Words can become destructive. Theology can become hurtful and devastating. And it's this view of prayer that can make unanswered prayers, in my opinion, feel like a wrecking ball in your gut and alienate you from God, from your faith and your community. And unfortunately, it's the lens of prayer that most of us have been given to look through. That's what we've been taught, that this is the only way. And so I want to pause for a moment on this Jesus story and ask a very simple question, which is, what is prayer? And I think we have to start there. I think we have to start there to understand why it's unanswered. So what is prayer? At its simplest definition, which we talked about a little bit at the beginning, is it's just simply a dialogue with God, right? That is the easiest way to understand prayer, a dialogue with God. But prayer, I think, is important to note, it's not subjected just to Christianity. Prayer is universal. I think prayer is the language of our soul. Prayer establishes and enriches our relationship with God. It's powerful. And I think it's an honest communication. Really, your truest. It's when you've taken down that false self. This is your truest communication with God. And that creates intimacy with God. So without talking to God and without listening to God, how do we ever really know or experience God? It's through this act of prayer. And just like communication, there's many forms of prayer. And yet often in Christian faith, we usually only see petitionary prayer. And that's usually its sole form. So God help me, God help them, God do this, God do that. And it's prayer in the form of requests instead of prayer in the form of being. We often use prayer as a way of controlling things that we cannot control. And I have done that and will do that probably for the rest of my life. I don't think there's anything wrong. I want to pause in case someone is feeling like that is saying that's a negative thing. That's a human thing. When we've come to the end of our rope and we don't know what else to do, it is normal and it is human for us to cry out to God because we can't control our circumstances. But yet these scriptures show us really that we can and we should ask. We should ask. It says ask, seek, and knock. It does say those things. And so I don't want to minimize that in any way. But yet I think it's important that we understand that is just one small portion of prayer. And I also will say, let me say I do believe in miracles. And it might make me sound charismatic and woo-woo, but I do believe in healing. But can I just say that miracles are called miracles because they're rare? And I think it's important that we hear that. I grew up in a tradition where it was healing for everything. You stubbed your big toe in the name of Jesus. That's how it was. Everything. But I have to say it was a giant letdown when I faced very large crises in my life and I didn't have that thing happen. Because I was given this lens that it was everything is a miracle, everything's a miracle. Miracles are rare. And I think they ought to be sought after and celebrated. But that's why they're called that. Otherwise, it would be the norm. It would be the ordinary. And if you've prayed for miracles in this place, I want you to know you're not alone. A recent Gallup survey showed that 79% of people have prayed for healing for themselves. 79, so almost 80%, which is a majority of this room, have prayed for some form of healing. And we're also, mind you, not talking about just the Christian faith. We're talking about people. Every single human that they surveyed, almost 80%. That's a very, very large portion. And then 87% have prayed for others for healing. So we can see this is a very human thing to do. We're hardwired for this. We're hardwired to talk and commune with God. I love this quote by C.S. Lewis. It says, prayer in the sense of petition, asking for things, is a small part of it. Confession and penitence are at its threshold, adoration, its sanctuary, the presence and the vision and the enjoyment of God, its bread and wine. I love that. You get a different sense that, yes, it's a petition and asking for things and confession. These are all part of prayer. But the bread and wine, and I don't know about you, but I really like bread and wine. That's where prayer is. It's the enjoyment of God. And here we have this imagery that prayer is about God's presence, that God is in us, God is in others, and I truly believe that, and God is all around us. And through the years, I've come to discover this revelation about prayer. And while talking about this message throughout the last few weeks, my wife summarized it for me the other day in a simple sentence, and she said, prayer is about the act and not the answer. And I went, man, yes. That is such a simple sentence that summarizes every single thing that I've been writing down. Prayer is about the act and not always the answer. But we always want it to be about the answer, right? Because we often approach prayer like a genie in a bottle or a vending machine. And we want instantaneous results from this thing. We want an instant change in our circumstances, a sudden healing, even a winning lottery ticket, right? We want that. And when we see some prayers answered and some that aren't, we're left with this giant question that's hanging over our heads. Why? Why? And that's, again, a very normal and human response. In 1972, psychologist Jerome Kagan concluded that uncertainty resolution was at the forefront of our behavior as human beings. That basically we want to eliminate the distress of the unknown. Hello, I agree. We don't like the unknown. that really we want to achieve cognitive closure. We're hardwired for closure, hardwired for it. And yet so much of this life has loose ends, which puts us in this really interesting tension between wanting closure and not having it. And so what do we do with those loose ends? Who will be our scapegoat? Because sometimes that's what we want too. We want someone to blame for this. How could you let this happen? And that's okay too. What do we do with it? And what do we do with our whys? And so when we're asking the question why, we're often given quick answers, as I mentioned before, that a lot of faith communities like to give. And I do believe they're well-meaning individuals. I just think they're uncomfortable and may not know how to respond, or may have been given the same response again and again, and we're told that's just how we should be. So we're given things like, well, his ways are higher than our ways. Maybe it's not God's will. Or I've heard you have sin in your life. I've heard that one a few times. Or you lack faith, or did you try praying harder, or your motives aren't pure. You start getting a laundry list of maybe reasons why God didn't answer your prayer until it just becomes all about you and how awful of a human you are. And why isn't God listening to me? And we're often told to wait and pray some more. And we're told to trust God. And I get it. And I've said some of those things before, and I've been on the receiving end of those things before. And it changes your perspective when you're on the other end. Totally changes everything. When you're on the other end, you're like, wow, you have no idea what I'm going through. No idea. And those answers fall short when we're faced with suffering. Those quick statements, they're like salt to a wound. They really are. And our hearts are fragile and our minds are built to seek certainty in the face of uncertain situations. So how on earth do we approach this whole thing? And how should we approach those, in my opinion, how should we approach others asking the question, why? So there's 2 points I would like us to find this morning. And one is how we should respond to others in the why, and the other part is for those that are in the why, right? So I know there's people in different circumstances here this morning. There are people here that are really questioning these things themselves. And then there are people that aren't, but even with us, we have a call to action. We might not be questioning, we might not have an unanswered prayer, but we have a call. And so remember the story at the beginning with Jesus, and we talked about earlier how he's praying in the garden, and he's scared and he's full of sorrow. There's scriptures that note in Luke 22:44 that says, being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. So again, we're not just talking about a little bit of pain. We're talking about anguish. His prayers, I'd like to think, were made of the same blood, sweat, and tears that can be found in a mother praying for her dying child. A patient diagnosed with a terminal illness. A man who's lost his job and can't provide food for his family and risks losing everything. Jesus' words echoed the prayers of every person, which I thought was powerful because Jesus faced our humanity even before he was on that cross. And we're often given that picture. He faced this long before. And so then when he was done praying, he goes back to his disciples and he finds them fast asleep. And if you remember what I said before, he asked them to stay awake and to be with him, to pray with him, to take watch. And so he finds them asleep, and I imagine he's probably devastated, and he says, couldn't you keep watch with me for 1 hour? Like, can't you just stay awake for 1 hour when I need you? And I get this sense that this was one of many, and maybe one of the first of betrayals that Jesus faced. See, Jesus expressed that his soul is swallowed up in sorrow, and he had this simple request for the disciples, that they would be with him. And it's like he was asking, in my opinion, if you were to put this in modern day times, he was asking for moral support. Moral support, and I often think that's what prayer is when we say, I'll pray for you. I think that's a really human way of saying, I'll be there for you, when we say that to people. And he's asking for that, for support, for prayers, for comfort, for solidarity, and yet they fell asleep. And I don't think sleep is the problem here, right? I don't think we're talking about sleep. I think it's that his community failed him. I think it's that while he was suffering, they weren't there to comfort him. And he probably felt abandoned. So sometimes when we're in this situation, I think what is the most powerful thing to do is to sit and wait with someone. There's power in that. No fancy words, no empty promises or grand gestures or pretending like we can explain it all, but literally just sitting in solidarity and in our suffering and in our unanswered prayers. The Christian tradition has been so quick to claim that it holds all the answers to life's problems, not just unanswered prayers, but to everything. And sometimes there isn't an answer, there's only action. I will be transparent. I have no idea why some prayers are answered and others aren't. And if you're looking for certainty, I wish I could provide that to you, but I can't. Because I have no idea why some people face suffering and others don't. I only know, because I've experienced this myself in the face of suffering, that it is my responsibility to sit with them. That is the only thing I know. And yet we often read in scriptures that when God wants something done, he uses people. He uses people. How many of our favorite Bible stories we look at, you look and it involves a person that God used. And maybe we are supposed to be the answer to someone's prayer. For some of us, that might be a literal answer to prayer. I think a few of us probably have enough money to go around and help somebody that needs help, to help clothe someone, to help feed someone. Maybe for some of us, that involves using our knowledge to discover medical treatments and cures. That is a very real thing. And to provide someone with comfort and love and guidance. And for some of us, that literally is just going to be in the form of solidarity and comfort. So we can see now that we can be there for each other when we're all facing life's hard questions. But let me speak for a moment to the person who's in that struggle, the pain of the unanswered prayer. Like I said, this was a tough one because we want sort of a formula. Well, this is what I'll do, and this is what I'll say, and this is how I'll say it, and I just want God to help me. And I want you to know, first of all, that I understand, because I have prayed for a lot of things that have gone unanswered. And ironically, I've prayed for some things that did radically get answered. And I don't really know why. And yet I keep praying, and it's something I do. And I think it's important for you, if you're in that situation, I think it is important that you ask the question, why? Because why really does help us process. I think that's the first step in anything. It helps us process your doubts, your grief, your frustrations. And this is a necessary step. And most faith communities want us to gloss over it. They want us to just skim right over, trust God. I think you can trust God with your words, which means expressing how you're really feeling. And yet in the same breath, the whys don't always solve anything. So more often than not, we can get stuck at the intersection of faith and doubt and questions and doubt, where we're begging for a reason why. Why? And so I want to ask you for a moment, if you were to take a minute and think where you're at. Does the answer why really change your circumstances or outcome? I know it would provide some relief and at least certainty in the explanation, but does it change your outcome? So I prayed my whole life that I wouldn't be gay. I wasn't going to share that this morning, but I am now. Obviously, I mentioned in the beginning of my sermon I have a wife, so that didn't change. I attempted suicide. I was a person that carried that struggle around heavier than almost any grief that I have faced. God never answered my prayer, not in the way I wanted. And I'll say I'm thankful because in a way it turned out to be a total blessing in disguise. Talia's amazing. But it was anguish and agony. And I thought so many people wanted to explain why I'm gay or want to know my story or want to know why. And I stopped and I thought about it. Does the knowing why even change things? It doesn't. And some people have reasons. But does it change things? It doesn't. And that's where things are hard, is we have to rest in this. Our circumstances are our circumstances. So then your why pivots and becomes a what now. It becomes a what now. What do I do? Where do I go from here? And I think that's a very important question because why is such a certain question for a very uncertain world. And so we, I think, have to go, well, what now? I'm in this, and how do I get through this? As I said before, I think a large portion of that answer lies in all of us, being present and showing up for each other during grief and pain. But for you, I want to encourage you that first, you're not alone, and I do mean that. Whatever you are going through, it's so easy for our minds to alienate ourselves and feel like we are the only human that has ever faced this, ever felt this, ever been angry with God, ever questioned, ever been sick, hurt, broken, mad, fill in the blank. You're not alone. I think that's important. Second, keep communicating with God. And before you go, why on earth would I talk to God? He did this to me. I want to encourage you to join in a practice that we don't often do as Christians, although it is a very Christian tradition, and it's the form of lament prayer. So we see this in Psalms 22, 1 through 2. It says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning? And we see it again in Psalms 13:2. How long, O Lord, will you utterly forget me? That's a form of prayer. That is a form of prayer. And in Psalms, I love it because we see that everything is acceptable in prayer. Not just joy and praise, right? But the grief, the anger, the questioning. That is okay. And so when I say keep communicating with God, that is what I mean. But the key here is the communication keeps going because prayer may not always change our circumstances, but it changes us. Prayer connects us to God. It connects us to others. Prayer gives us compassion. And for those that might be skeptical of prayer altogether, because there's a few of you in here, I'm sure too, that are kind of like, okay, wait a minute. I don't even know if I'm on board with this prayer thing at all. There's room for you in this place too. Because prayer, honestly, can have emotional benefits that's similar to seeing a therapist. True story. I'm not saying stop seeing your therapist. Maybe do that and have prayer. But prayer helps us see and process our grief and pain. And literally, when I say it's a true story that it does help us, scientists are able to make steps which are wild, that is this whole thing called neurotheology. It's fascinating, where they're studying the brain and how our faith life affects our brain. And it is so fascinating to me because it's like for the first time ever, we're seeing proof of what this does in our bodies. And one of the studies that's been conducted on neurotheology was originally on the study of memory. And so they took 40 older individuals with memory loss problems. And that was their original target. Like, we're going to study how memory functions work. And what they wanted to do is see kind of how prayer would affect this memory issue. And instead, it really then became more of a study on prayer because the results were staggering. And so these people didn't have a religious background, and they didn't go to church, right? So chances are these people were either skeptical or just kind of agnostic, or maybe just didn't really care too much. So this makes it even more fascinating that this is someone who isn't of a faith mind. They were taught a simple prayer that they would repeat daily for a certain amount of time. And during this time, they scanned their brains for 8 weeks. And they started noticing changes, physical changes in the brain because of the act of prayer. Again, the act, not the answer, but the act of prayer. They saw changes in their frontal cortex and their frontal lobes, which are responsible for thought, creativity, concentration, emotion. And they're interconnected with the limbic system, which that's responsible for your emotions and your instinct. And so they started to find themselves becoming more peaceful, more aware, more alert, having compassion, less stress, less anxiety, and they experienced self-worth and love. And so the study concluded that prayer actually physically transforms people. And so some may call that God, and for those that are maybe on the with God, you can call that science, and I think you're both correct. I think we can all agree, yes. And so I think what's interesting is, I don't know about you, but going through that dark night of the soul, I could use more joy, self-worth, and love. I really can. St. Augustine says, the purpose of unanswered prayer is to force expansion of the heart. I'm not claiming this is the reason why it happens. I don't even think we focus on the reason and the why, but what I'm saying is that pain can be one of our greatest teachers in life if we allow it to be. So instead of giving you a quick answer and a remedy, I'm sure none of you thought you were getting one anyway, but what I want for you guys is more or less to hear from people who are here in the what now. I've asked my sister, Jessica, and my friend Wendy to come and share some of their stories and experiences that have kind of caused them to ask the what nows and explore through there. Hi.
Hi.
Okay, there's a microphone. Oh, do you have tissues? Uh-oh. If you guys need tissues. I asked them because I feel like I can share till I'm blue in the face, my thoughts and my reasons, but it's really powerful when you start to hear from other people. Again, it creates that sense of community that you're not alone. When there's many voices echoing similar stories, it gives comfort. So I have a few questions I have for them and ask them to kind of share. And so to both of them, I ask, now that you both have had some hardships in your life, and I know them both really well, so I've heard a little bit of the backstory of the hardships, but you've had some hardships that have really caused you guys to seek God in prayer, that deep, sorrowful prayer. Would you guys mind kind of sharing, I know this is big, would you guys mind sharing a little bit of those circumstances with people?
Yeah. So for me, my whole life I've had, God really answer my prayers. I don't know why, like Jan said, asking God and seeing things just happen and show up. Until my daughter was diagnosed with diabetes, and, you spend your whole life praying, and you see your child potentially at the gate of eternity, and your faith breaks, and I didn't know what to do with that, because my faith just shattered, really, truly, and I didn't really have a choice in the matter. It was automatic, I was instantly faithless and angry, angry that God had reneged on all the requests that I had made for my children to be safe their whole life. You pray for your kids from infancy until forever, and so here we are, and she's not safe, and now I'm angry, and that brought me to existential crisis, shame because of my anger at God, the inability to speak to God about it because I was embarrassed about, you're not supposed to be angry at God, or at least that's how I felt, so here you are, you're furious. I mean, the ugliness of the power of the anger that I felt towards God was shocking, and who do you talk to about that? You say something and people distance themselves from you like you have a disease. I mean, nobody wants to talk to you about that. And so you're just kind of left in the dark night of the soul, which is the alone space, just you and God who loves you, but yet you're so angry you can't see that.
So that beautiful baby that was sitting up here, that is my son. A little bit of backstory. 3 years ago, my wife and I decided to grow our family. And being that we are two women, we needed a little bit of help with that. So we sought out a fertility clinic, did 6, IUIs, and none of them worked. Each one was a little bit harder to get that negative test. And so after almost a year of that, we paused and we said, all right, we need to see what's going on. We need to see if this is really something that God is leading us towards. And so we, for 2 weeks, took a sabbatical and we prayed and we sought God and about next steps. Are we supposed to grow our family? All these kinds of things. And we both got direction on how to move forward, and that was choosing IVF. And so we all steam ahead, started that process, and we got pregnant. And we followed this curriculum. We sought God, and He answered, and all this, and then we lost the baby. And speaking for myself, I felt gypped. I felt like I had sought God's voice. I had sought His face, and I was left robbed of a daughter. And talk about deconstruction of my faith. Walking through that time, I felt like my foundation was ripped out from me. I did not trust God anymore. And closing that part of my heart, closing that part of my faith, we still wanted to grow our family. We did IVF again. And we got pregnant, but we were told that this pregnancy had about a 10% chance of surviving. And at that point, I was at work and I got that information. I went into the bathroom and I hadn't prayed since prior to the miscarriage. And I looked up at the heavens and I said, I don't know what the hell you think you're doing, but you need to show up. And my faith was ultimately on the line in that. And He did. And my son is a product of that, but I'm still reeling in this deconstruction. I still am in a messy spot, if you will, with my faith.
So with that, then, since you have the mic, we'll go with you, Jess. Do you feel your prayers are still unanswered?
Yeah, they're still unanswered.
Wendy, since you have a son, which most of us would say is an answer to prayer, do you feel your prayer is still unanswered?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I still don't have my daughter.
Okay. So after all this suffering and unanswered prayers, do you still pray?
Absolutely.
Why?
Because the other option feels like death. I mean, you're already in pain. You're already hurting. God is the only one that has the answer to the freedom from that pain. You know, to live a life without the magic and the beauty and the mystery of God is far worse than living with the pain that started you into the dark night in the first place. So for me, it was a choice of logic, I guess. It was like, just stay permanently in pain, right, and then add the loss of God to this permanent pain, or...
So you welcomed God to walk with you in that pain.
Yeah.
To be with you in that pain.
Yeah.
What about you, Wen? Do you still pray? And I'm not, this isn't like a check prayer, you're going to heaven.
In thinking of this, I grew up in a faith tradition. It's such a part of my DNA, just such a natural response. And so I find myself praying, but I don't necessarily believe that my prayers might be answered. In all honesty, it's kind of a crapshoot. I adore my son, and I pray over him. I feel like I need all the help that I can get, whether or not it happens, you know.
Okay. Has this changed your view on God, either of you?
1,000,000%. I think the positive aspect of not having my way all the time, I guess, is that oddly enough, it made me trust God. So, you know, the byproduct was trust, a more concrete trust than I had previous to the breakdown. You know, the breakdown led me into, you know, really big questions, you know, and they kind of roll around and you feel like you get an answer and then that disappears. And really what I see is it's, you know, God removing like the false religious box. You know, I had all my beliefs lined up, everything made sense. And then and I don't know if he does this, you know, so there's that. But life happens and my box gets destroyed and I have no more box. And then it's, what do you do now? And you realize that you don't really need a box and you're fine without it, and that God is still in control, and he still loves us, and he still loves my child. And even though there is pain and suffering here, I still have that deep faith in his love.
So you say
it's more sober.
Trust and control. Now, what does that look like to someone, let's say, who has lost a loved one? And they go, where's that trust and where's that control?
First of all, I'll be very careful, you know, giving a really definitive answer, because, you know, people would speak to me when I was in grief and say things that, you know, honestly, in my mind, I punched them in their face, you know, because it's not kind. You know, when you're really grieving, sometimes the best thing to do is just say nothing at all, you know, and just maybe hug somebody. You know, don't try and be smart and fix it, because you can't.
Well, when you said to me the other day that trust for you isn't what trust is, that I think the perspective that we were raised with, which is meant kind of what I mentioned earlier, that God has a plan. He's in control. He's doing everything. What it meant for you was you could trust him with your innermost prayers and thoughts, which meant being like, as you said, where the hell are you? It meant being that transparent.
Absolutely. For me, what it came down to, you know, at first I tried to Pollyanna the situation, you know, because I tend to be, you know, positive-minded, And so I thought, well, you just fake it till you make it. I'm going to just start speaking positive. I'm going to start declaring faith. I just went into the religious practice that I was taught my whole life. I'm going to whitewash this, and maybe if I can work myself up into, a positive enough attitude to receive a healing for my child, then everything's going to work out, and it's got to be me. What I wasn't prepared for was I know that's not what God wanted. And I literally could feel God pulling me. In my mind, what I saw actually was God pulling me into the boxing ring, or holding my hair back while I threw it all up in the toilet. These were the images that came to my mind. It was this soul-wrenching. I was so seething angry. I can't even describe to you. One evening, that it was like the pivot of the pain. I had consumed an entire bottle of wine. I was in my bedroom, and I'm having it out with God, and I am screaming. I am in pain, and I'm like, why the hell did you do this? I've trusted you. I believe in you. Where are you? Why did you leave me? Why didn't you choose to do it to me? Why my kid? What the heck? I don't get it. And so here I am, and I'm embarrassed because, I couldn't stop it. Once it started to come out, it just was like, you're just throwing it all up. And God's like, just bring it, sister. And I'm like, What happened in that moment was something really profound. 4 of my girlfriends showed up at my house unannounced and uncoordinated. And I'm upstairs screaming bloody murder at God, and you could hear everything in this house that we used to live in. The walls are paper thin, so that means my kids could hear it. My ex-husband at the time, my friends when they came in the house, oh wow, she's having a moment. They came, and for me, it was this transparency and this honesty with God. And what shocked me was that God wasn't angry, but he was kind. And it was like, okay, get it out. What I realize now is I think that anger was there all along. It just took the right stimulus to trigger it all the way out. I think that we have these feelings that this distrust, and as long as everything goes our way, it doesn't show up. But when things don't go our way, there it is. And now we have to sit with it.
So has my view of God changed? Jess touched on it in that talking about this deconstruction. My going through this, my foundation was ripped from me. I was angry, and I still kind of am, and still am working through that. But I feel like the God that I knew, his persona changed to me. My prayer is always, usually, God, would you be who I need you to be? And so he took on a different persona, and he gently started kind of wooing me back. There's something, while I'm angry and while I have doubts and while I don't know what I believe, I still can't help but listen to worship music all the time. And I still hear God speak to me. When I was pregnant, I was driving home one day, and I heard God say, you know the love that you have for your son? I love him so much more, and I love you so much more than that. So he's still gently wooing me. I'm still wrestling, still figuring that out.
Okay, so I don't know if this is
There we go, I think. Okay, so I'll leave you one final question. Again, everything's not going to be neat and tidy, so I don't think we're going to leave you with this is what This is how you solve things. But I do think this question is important because it might give people some help in how to navigate. So the question for you both is, in the dark night of the soul, what was your greatest source of encouragement?
When you asked that question when we were talking previous to today, I sat there going, I should come up with something positive to leave people with because this is going to be really hard and heavy and could trigger a crisis of faith in the audience. So let's not leave them there. The reality is that there wasn't any comfort. I wish that I could say that there was, but there wasn't. That's why it's the dark night of the soul, because it sucks. It's like being crushed. There isn't relief until it's over. And then there's relief. There were moments of connection where people would just be with me or meet me and not having to answer or not having to comfort me. Because comfort is almost something you reject. It makes me understand why people used to, do the sackcloth and ashes thing, which seems so dramatic. As a young person reading that, it was like, gosh, that's so drama queen. Sit in sackcloth and throw ashes on yourself. Wow. But now it's like when you're really in pain, you almost reject the sources of joy or comfort that could come to you because you're hurting so bad. It just eclipses everything. I couldn't pray in that space, so sometimes just having people pray for me, even though sometimes I was angry and resistant to the process of prayer from others. But really, it's going through it and getting out on the other side and knowing that it's not going to last forever. For those of us who've had babies, it's the transition space of your spirit. And on the other side, you're going to be like, oh, yes, hallelujah. But while you're in it, not so much.
Okay. What about you, Wen? What was your greatest source of encouragement during that time?
I would say community. We had people show up with meals, show up just to sit with us, show up to validate our feelings. When we got pregnant the second time, and the pregnancy, it was touch and go. We kind of called on our tribe and said, you know what, we need you to pray for us. We need you to hope for us. We're not at that space to be able to do that yet. We need you to fill in this gap for us. So community, definitely.
Okay. You guys want to give a round of applause and thank them? Thank you both. I so appreciate their honesty. And we ran long this morning, really intentionally to give them space. So what we'll do is we're going to go ahead. I know the worship team, they're like, what are we doing? We're going to switch things, and we're going to end in a different way. We're going to end in a way that really just resounds with a short, simple prayer, since it is on prayer. And we're going to leave you with that. We're going to leave you with that to just think on it. And I want you to be able to take a moment and know that there's often healing that comes with prayer, but it's often healing with the heart and soul. And that is powerful. And I really think that can get you through the darkest of times. And so author Marianne Williamson says, through prayer, we find what we cannot find elsewhere, a peace that is not of this world. She encourages us to pray this simple prayer as a reminder that there is nowhere you need to go to find God, for God is within you. And that prayer is this simple. It states, please enter where you already abide. And if you stop and think about it, you're like, what do you mean? Meaning you're giving God access to those places. God already abides in your dark night of the soul. God already abides in your unanswered questions and unanswered prayers. It's just acknowledging and saying, please abide. So let's take a moment to say this prayer together. We can lay our questions, our doubts, our hurts, our grief, everything before God, giving him access to our broken spaces.